The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor of Westminster Palace as Lady Margaret Thornfield adjusted the clasp of her grandmother's emerald necklace. The ancient piece, passed down through 7 generations of the Thornfield family, caught the light streaming through the tall windows, sending green sparkles dancing across the ornate walls. She had worn it today for the annual Heritage Foundation Gala, a prestigious event where Britain's oldest families gathered to celebrate their ancestral contributions to the crown. Margaret stood before the gilded mirror in the East Wing's preparation chamber, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the necklace. The emerald centerpiece, roughly the size of a robin's egg, was surrounded by diamonds that had been cut in the 1600s. Her grandmother had told her stories about how the necklace had survived the London Blitz, hidden in a secret compartment while bombs fell around their family estate. It had been present at royal coronations, state dinners, and countless family celebrations. Today would mark its first public appearance in over a decade. The palace halls buzzed with activity as guests began arriving for the afternoon ceremony. Margaret's heels clicked rhythmically against the polished stone floors as she made her way toward the grand hall, where the event would take place. She nodded politely to other attendees, many of whom she had known since childhood. The weight of tradition hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh flowers that had been arranged throughout the corridors. Captain James Harrison of the Royal Guard stood at his designated post near the main entrance to the Grand Hall, his trained eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. At 34, he had served the royal household for over a decade, working his way up from a junior guardsman to one of the most trusted members of the security detail. His military background had prepared him well for the role, but nothing had quite prepared him for the unique challenges that came with protecting both the royal family and the countless dignitaries who frequented the palace. James noticed Lady Margaret the moment she entered the hall. It wasn't just her striking appearance that caught his attention, though. She was undeniably elegant in her navy blue dress. It was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, and more notably, the remarkable necklace that adorned her throat. He had been briefed on many of the valuable items that would be present at today's event, but this particular piece seemed to radiate its own importance. The grand hall gradually filled with approximately 200 guests, each representing families with centuries-old ties to the British monarchy. Crystal chandeliers illuminated conversations about heritage, philanthropy, and the preservation of historical artifacts. Waitstaff moved smoothly through the crowd, offering champagne and canapés, while maintaining the atmosphere of refined celebration. Margaret found herself in conversation with Lord Pemberton, an elderly gentleman whose family had served as advisors to the crown for nearly 4 centuries. They discussed the importance of preserving family heirlooms and the stories they carried through generations. As she spoke, Margaret unconsciously touched her necklace, a gesture that had become habit whenever she wore precious family pieces. Unknown to the gathered guests, David Chen had been planning this moment for months. At 28, he had built a reputation in certain circles as someone who could acquire valuable items through less conventional means. His research into the Heritage Foundation Gala had revealed that some of Britain's most precious family heirlooms would be on display, worn by their owners rather than locked away in bank vaults. The Thornfield emerald necklace had particularly caught his interest during his careful surveillance of the event's guest list. David had spent weeks studying the palace layout, memorizing guard rotations, and identifying potential escape routes. He had even managed to secure temporary employment with the catering company hired for the event, giving him legitimate access to the palace grounds. His plan was simple in concept, but required precise timing and nerves of steel. As the formal ceremony began, guests gathered around a small stage where the Heritage Foundation's chairman began speaking about the importance of preserving Britain's cultural legacy. Margaret stood near the middle of the crowd, her attention focused on the speaker's words about how family treasures connected the present to the past. David positioned himself near the serving station closest to Margaret's location, using his catering uniform to blend seamlessly into the background. He had observed her movements throughout the event, noting that she tended to stand in the same general area and had a habit of moving her hand to her necklace when she was engaged in serious conversation. Captain Harrison maintained his position near the entrance, but his attention was divided between monitoring the crowd and keeping track of the various security protocols in place for the event. The palace employed multiple layers of security, from uniformed guards like himself to plainclothes officers mingling with the guests. Electronic surveillance covered every angle of the Grand Hall, and metal detectors had screened every person entering the building. The ceremony continued, with various speakers sharing stories about their family histories and the artifacts that had been preserved through the centuries. Margaret listened intently, particularly when Lady Catherine Ashworth spoke about a silver tea service that had belonged to her ancestor, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria. The stories resonated with Margaret's own understanding of how objects could carry the weight of history. David made his move during a particularly emotional moment in the ceremony when the entire audience was focused on a presentation about families who had lost heirlooms during World War II. He had timed it perfectly, waiting for the moment when even the security personnel would be drawn into the speaker's narrative about sacrifice and preservation. Moving with practiced stealth, David approached Margaret from behind and to her left, where a small gap in the crowd provided the perfect angle of approach. His movements were casual, appearing to anyone who might notice as simply another staff member navigating through the gathered guests. In one fluid motion, David's hand shot forward toward Margaret's neck, his fingers closing around the emerald necklace. The antique clasp, weakened by centuries of use, gave way more easily than he had anticipated. The weight of the piece surprised him momentarily, but his grip remained firm as he began to pull away from Margaret. Margaret felt the sudden tug at her throat and spun around in shock, her hand instinctively moving to where her necklace had been just moments before. Her eyes met David's for a split second, and she saw the determination in his expression as he clutched her family's most precious heirloom. The realization of what was happening hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just theft. It was the loss of 7 generations of family history, stories, and connections to her ancestors. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, recounting the tales of how the necklace had survived wars, economic hardships, and family tragedies. Margaret's shocked gasp caught the attention of Lord Pemberton, who turned to see what had caused her distress. His eyes widened as he noticed the absence of the remarkable necklace she had been wearing just moments earlier, and then he saw the figure in catering attire moving rapidly away from Margaret, with something clutched in his hand. David had taken no more than 3 steps when Lord Pemberton's voice rang out across the Grand Hall, cutting through the speaker's presentation with startling clarity. The elderly gentleman's military training from decades past kicked in, as he shouted a warning that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. "So," Captain Harrison's head snapped toward the commotion, his trained reflexes immediately assessing the situation. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the difference between minor disturbances and genuine security threats. The panic in Lord Pemberton's voice combined with Lady Margaret's obvious distress triggered every alarm in his professional consciousness. The ceremony ground to an immediate halt as guests began turning toward the source of the disturbance. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, champagne glasses were lowered, and the carefully maintained atmosphere of refined celebration shifted to one of confused concern. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her hand still pressed to her throat where her grandmother's necklace had rested just seconds before. The absence of its familiar weight felt wrong, as if a part of her own identity had been torn away. She watched in horror as the man who had taken her family's treasure continued moving toward what appeared to be a service entrance at the far end of the Grand Hall. David's carefully planned escape route suddenly felt inadequate as he realized the level of attention his actions had generated. He had expected to have several more seconds of confusion before anyone noticed what had happened, but the immediate response from both Margaret and Lord Pemberton had compressed his timeline dramatically. The emerald necklace felt heavier in his grasp than he had anticipated, and he could feel its intricate metalwork pressing into his palm as he clutched it tightly. Part of him marveled at the craftsmanship even as he focused on reaching the exit that would lead him through the service corridors and ultimately out of the palace. Captain Harrison's training took over as he began moving through the crowd with purpose and authority. His radio crackled to life as he reported the situation to the Central Security Command, requesting immediate backup and activation of lockdown procedures. The palace's security protocols had been designed for exactly this type of situation, though they were rarely put to such dramatic use. Other security personnel throughout the Grand Hall began responding to Harrison's alert, their positions shifting to form a coordinated net designed to prevent any unauthorized person from leaving the area. The guests, many of whom had never witnessed such excitement at a royal event, began moving aside to clear pathways for the security team. Margaret finally found her voice and called out to the retreating figure, her words carrying across the hall with desperate urgency. She pleaded for the return of her necklace, explaining that it was irreplaceable family history, not merely valuable jewelry. Her words struck several guests who understood the significance of family heirlooms and the stories they carried. David heard Margaret's plea but pushed forward toward his planned exit, knowing that hesitation would doom his entire operation. He had studied enough similar situations to understand that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly, measured now in seconds rather than minutes. The grand hall erupted into controlled chaos as guests tried to understand what was happening, while security personnel worked to maintain order and apprehend the suspect. The Heritage Foundation chairman stood at the podium, uncertain whether to continue the ceremony or wait for the situation to resolve. Captain Harrison weaved through the crowd with increasing urgency, his eyes locked on David's retreating figure. Years of physical training had prepared him for exactly this type of pursuit, and he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes situations. The ornate surroundings of the palace seemed to blur as the drama unfolded, with centuries of history serving as the backdrop for this modern crime. Portraits of long-dead monarchs looked down upon the scene as if bearing witness to another chapter in the palace's long and sometimes dramatic story. Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of her grandmother, and the promise she had made to protect the family's treasures for future generations. The necklace represented more than monetary value. It was a tangible connection to her ancestors and their struggles, triumphs, and enduring legacy. David reached the service entrance and pushed through the door, finding himself in a narrow corridor lined with paintings and storage areas. His footsteps echoed off the stone walls as he moved as quickly as possible toward what he hoped would be freedom and success. Behind him, Captain Harrison's pursuit intensified as he too reached the service entrance, pausing momentarily to radio his position and direction to other security team members. The chase was now fully engaged, with the palace's corridors serving as the arena for this high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The afternoon sun continued streaming through the palace windows, casting the same beautiful patterns it had created earlier, but now illuminating a drama that none of the morning's preparations had anticipated. The weight of history, tradition, and family legacy hung in the balance as the pursuit began in earnest through the ancient halls of Westminster Palace. Captain Harrison burst through the service entrance, his polished boots echoing against the stone corridor as he immediately assessed his surroundings. The narrow hallway stretched in two directions, with David having chosen the path that led deeper into the palace's service areas. Harrison's radio crackled with updates from other security team members as they moved to establish a perimeter around the building's exits. The corridor David had chosen was lined with portraits of former palace staff and historical figures, their painted eyes seeming to watch the unfolding chase. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows along the walls, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere as the pursuit intensified. David's catering uniform, which had been his perfect disguise moments earlier, now made him easily identifiable to the security cameras that tracked his movement through the service areas. Behind Harrison, the Grand Hall remained in a state of controlled disruption as other security personnel worked to calm the guests while maintaining the integrity of the crime scene. Margaret stood near where the theft had occurred, providing details to Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, who had arrived within minutes of the initial alert. The detective's questions were precise and professional, but Margaret's answers came in fragments as shock continued to set in. Detective Inspector Matthews had seen many theft cases during her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, but crimes within palace walls carried additional weight and complexity. The victim's emotional state was clearly fragile, and Matthews understood that this wasn't simply about monetary loss. The tremor in Margaret's voice when she described her grandmother's stories about the necklace revealed the deeper significance of what had been taken. David navigated the service corridors with growing desperation, his initial confidence beginning to crack as he realized the extent of the security response. His research had been thorough, but experiencing the palace's lockdown procedures firsthand was entirely different from studying them on paper. Each turn he took seemed to lead to longer corridors with fewer options for escape. The emerald necklace remained clutched in his right hand, its weight serving as a constant reminder of both his success and his precarious situation. He had successfully obtained one of the most valuable pieces present at the event, but possession meant nothing if he couldn't escape with it. The craftsmanship that had made the necklace so desirable now seemed to mock him with its beauty and significance. Captain Harrison's pursuit was methodical and relentless, his training allowing him to maintain a pace that would eventually wear down his quarry while conserving his own energy. He spoke continuously into his radio, providing updates on their direction and requesting that other security personnel position themselves at key intersection points ahead of David's likely path. The palace's architecture, designed for ceremony and grandeur, proved challenging for someone attempting to navigate it quickly under stress. David found himself in a section of the building he hadn't explored during his reconnaissance, with corridors that seemed to curve and connect in unexpected ways. Service areas that had appeared straightforward on building plans now felt like a maze designed to confuse intruders. Margaret's statement to Detective Inspector Matthews revealed the careful planning that had gone into David's approach. She described how natural his movements had seemed, how he had appeared to be just another staff member until the moment he struck. The detective made detailed notes, understanding that the case would likely attract significant media attention, given its location and the nature of the victim. Lord Pemberton, who had first raised the alarm, provided his own account of the incident to another officer. His military background had allowed him to observe details that other witnesses might have missed, including David's direction of movement and the professional manner in which he had executed the theft. The elderly gentleman's sharp observations would prove crucial in understanding the suspect's methods and motivations. The palace's security control room had become a hub of coordinated activity as multiple officers monitored cameras throughout the building while maintaining radio contact with the pursuit team. Technical Sergeant Lisa Wong operated the camera controls with practiced efficiency, switching between different angles to maintain visual contact with both the suspect and Captain Harrison. David's breathing had become labored as the stress of the situation combined with the physical demands of navigating the palace's extensive corridor system. He paused at an intersection, trying to determine which direction offered the best chance of reaching an exit. The weight of his decision was compounded by the sound of Harrison's footsteps growing closer with each passing moment. The service corridors gradually led David toward the palace's lower levels, where the mechanical systems and storage areas were located. This section of the building was less familiar to him, but it also offered more potential hiding places and alternative routes. He pushed through a heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and found himself in a basement area filled with heating equipment and electrical panels. Captain Harrison reached the same door moments later, pausing to listen for any sound that might indicate David's direction. The mechanical noise from the building's systems created an acoustic challenge, but his trained hearing could distinguish between mechanical sounds and human movement. He proceeded carefully, understanding that the confined spaces ahead could be ideal for an ambush. Back in the Grand Hall, the Heritage Foundation's chairman had made the difficult decision to suspend the ceremony while the security situation was resolved. Guests were asked to remain in the area for their own safety and to assist with the investigation as needed. The atmosphere of celebration had been replaced by a mixture of concern, curiosity, and sympathy for Margaret's loss. Margaret found herself surrounded by supportive family friends who understood the significance of what had been taken. Lady Catherine Ashworth, who had spoken earlier about her own family heirlooms, stood beside Margaret as she continued providing information to the detective. The shared understanding of heritage and family legacy created an atmosphere of mutual support among the gathered nobility. Detective Inspector Matthews received regular updates from the pursuit team while continuing to gather evidence from the crime scene. She photographed the area where the theft had occurred, collected witness statements, and coordinated with the palace's security team to review camera footage from the moments leading up to the incident. David's exploration of the basement area revealed a complex network of tunnels and mechanical spaces that extended throughout the palace's foundation. Some of these passages appeared to connect to areas beyond the main building, potentially offering escape routes that hadn't been covered in his original research. The darkness and maze-like layout provided both opportunities and dangers as he tried to avoid capture. The emerald necklace caught occasional reflections from the emergency lighting as David moved through the basement, its beauty seeming almost surreal in the industrial surroundings. He couldn't help but imagine the historical events this piece had witnessed, the royal ceremonies and family celebrations, where it had been worn with pride and dignity. Captain Harrison's methodical search of the basement area required him to check numerous alcoves, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces where David might have taken refuge. Each potential hiding spot needed to be cleared systematically while maintaining awareness of other possible escape routes. His radio communication with the security control room provided crucial guidance about the basement's layout and exit points. Technical Sergeant Wong's camera surveillance had limitations in the basement areas where older sections of the palace lacked comprehensive coverage. She coordinated with building maintenance staff to obtain detailed floor plans that could guide the search team through areas where visual surveillance wasn't available. The physical demands of the chase were beginning to affect both men, but their motivations drove them forward with equal determination. David fought for freedom and the success of months of planning, while Harrison was driven by duty, training, and a personal sense of responsibility for protecting both the royal household and its guests. Margaret's conversation with Detective Inspector Matthews gradually revealed more details about the necklace's history and significance. The piece had been commissioned in 1647 by the first Earl of Thornfield as a gift for his wife, who had supported the royalist cause during the English Civil War. It had been present at the restoration of Charles II and had been worn at the coronations of multiple monarchs throughout its long history. The detective's understanding of the case's complexity grew as she learned about the necklace's provenance and cultural significance. This wasn't merely a theft of valuable jewelry. It was the loss of a tangible piece of British history that had survived wars, political upheavals, and centuries of social change. David's exploration of the basement tunnel system led him to an area that appeared to connect with the palace's original medieval foundations. The stonework here was clearly much older than the renovated sections above, with arched passages that spoke of centuries of continuous use and modification. He realized he might have found access to escape routes that predated modern security measures. Captain Harrison's pursuit had brought him to the same general area, where the ancient architecture created acoustic properties that made it easier to track movement through sound. He could hear David's footsteps echoing off the stone walls, though the exact direction remained unclear due to the tunnel system's complex layout. The radio communication between Harrison and the security control room became more challenging in the deeper sections of the palace, where the thick stone walls interfered with signal transmission. He found himself relying more on his own judgment and experience while maintaining sporadic contact with his support team. Above ground, additional security personnel had been deployed to monitor all known exits from the palace complex. The coordinated response involved not only the Royal Guard, but also metropolitan police units that had been called in to assist with the expanded search perimeter. Margaret's emotional state had stabilized somewhat as she focused on providing detailed information about the stolen necklace to aid in its recovery. She described its unique characteristics, including specific details about the emerald's cut and the arrangement of the surrounding diamonds that would help identify it if it was recovered or offered for sale. Detective Inspector Matthews had begun coordinating with specialized units that dealt with art and antique theft, understanding that the necklace's historical significance would require expert evaluation and handling if it was recovered. The case was already generating interest from cultural preservation organizations and insurance companies familiar with high-value historical artifacts. David's journey through the medieval tunnel system brought him to what appeared to be an exit point that opened into the palace gardens. The heavy wooden door was secured with modern locks, but he could see daylight filtering through gaps around its edges. Freedom seemed tantalizingly close, but the locked door represented a significant obstacle to his escape. The sound of Captain Harrison's approach through the tunnels added urgency to David's situation. He examined the door's locking mechanism, while listening to the echoing footsteps that indicated his pursuer was drawing closer. The centuries-old stones around him had witnessed countless dramas throughout British history, and now they were serving as the setting for another chapter in the ongoing story of crime and justice within the palace walls. Captain Harrison's tactical training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, where a suspect might become cornered and potentially dangerous. As he approached the medieval tunnel section where David was struggling with the garden exit door, Harrison slowed his pace and drew upon years of experience in apprehending suspects in confined spaces. The echo of his footsteps against the ancient stone walls announced his presence, but he knew that direct confrontation in these narrow passages could be risky for both men. David's desperation reached a critical point as he realized the garden door's modern security system was far more sophisticated than the medieval appearance had suggested. Electronic locks, motion sensors, and what appeared to be a silent alarm system had been discreetly integrated into the historical structure. His fingers worked frantically at the locking mechanism, while his ears strained to track Harrison's approach through the echoing tunnel system. The emerald necklace seemed to grow heavier in David's grip as the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. What had begun as a carefully planned operation was rapidly deteriorating into a desperate escape attempt with diminishing chances of success. The weight of the stolen artifact served as both motivation to continue and a reminder of the consequences he would face if captured. Back in the palace's security control room, Technical Sergeant Wong had managed to establish partial camera coverage of the tunnel area through auxiliary systems connected to the garden security network. The grainy images on her monitors showed two figures moving through the underground passages, confirming that the pursuit was reaching a critical phase. Detective Inspector Matthews had completed her initial interviews with Margaret and the key witnesses, building a comprehensive picture of how the theft had been executed. David's method showed clear signs of professional planning, from his infiltration of the catering staff to his knowledge of the palace layout. This suggested he might be connected to other similar crimes, or part of a larger organization specializing in high-value thefts. Margaret remained in the Grand Hall, surrounded by concerned friends and family members who had stayed to provide support during the investigation. Lady Catherine Ashworth had shared her own experiences with threats to family heirlooms, helping Margaret understand that she wasn't alone in facing the potential loss of irreplaceable family history. The emotional weight of losing her grandmother's necklace was beginning to settle over Margaret like a heavy blanket. Each minute that passed without recovery decreased the likelihood that the piece would ever be returned to her family. She found herself remembering specific occasions when her grandmother had worn the necklace, from Christmas dinners to formal state events, where it had represented the Thornfield family's long connection to the crown. Captain Harrison reached a position where he could see David silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the garden door. The suspect's body language revealed his growing desperation and the intensity of his efforts to escape. Harrison's training emphasized the importance of de-escalation in such situations, understanding that cornered suspects often made dangerous decisions when they felt trapped. Drawing upon his experience in hostage negotiation and crisis management, Harrison decided to attempt communication with David rather than simply rushing forward for a physical confrontation. He called out in a calm, authoritative voice, identifying himself as palace security and requesting that David stop his escape attempt and surrender the stolen property. David's response was immediate and defiant, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and determination, as he shouted back that he wouldn't be taken without completing his mission. The exchange echoed through the medieval stonework, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere, as two men from very different worlds faced each other in the ancient tunnels beneath one of Britain's most historic buildings. The conversation that followed revealed more about David's motivations than Harrison had expected. Rather than being driven solely by greed, David spoke about economic desperation, family financial pressures, and a sense that the wealthy elite hoarded treasures that should be shared more broadly with society. His words carried genuine emotion, though they did nothing to justify the theft of Margaret's irreplaceable family heirloom. Harrison found himself in the unusual position of understanding some of David's frustrations while remaining absolutely committed to recovering the stolen necklace and ensuring justice was served. His response acknowledged the economic challenges facing many people while firmly explaining why theft was never an acceptable solution, particularly when it involved items of such personal and historical significance. The dialogue between pursuer and pursued was interrupted by David's renewed assault on the garden door's locking mechanism. He had discovered what appeared to be a manual override system, possibly installed for emergency evacuations during historical periods when the palace faced various threats. The mechanism was old and corroded, but it showed signs of having been maintained over the centuries. Technical Sergeant Wong had managed to establish communication with garden security personnel, who were now positioned outside the door that David was attempting to breach. This created a coordinated containment situation where the suspect would face apprehension regardless of whether he continued forward or retreated back toward Captain Harrison. The garden security team included both uniformed officers and plainclothes personnel, who had been discreetly positioned throughout the palace grounds as part of the Heritage Foundation event's security protocol. Their presence ensured that even if David managed to escape the tunnel system, he would immediately face apprehension in the carefully monitored garden areas. Margaret's interview with Detective Inspector Matthews had evolved into a broader discussion about art theft and the underground market for historical artifacts. The detective explained how stolen pieces like the Thornfield necklace often disappeared into private collections where they might remain hidden for decades before surfacing again in legitimate markets. This conversation helped Margaret understand that recovering her necklace might require patience and ongoing investigation even if David was apprehended immediately. The piece's unique characteristics and historical documentation would be crucial in proving ownership and ensuring its return to the Thornfield family if it was eventually located. Lord Pemberton had remained in the Grand Hall to provide additional support to Margaret while sharing his own knowledge of military tactics and security procedures. His presence was comforting to Margaret, who appreciated having someone nearby who understood both the significance of family heritage and the complexities of security operations. The elderly gentleman's military experience led him to offer insights about the likely progression of the pursuit and apprehension process. He explained to Margaret how palace security would methodically close off escape routes while working to resolve the situation with minimal risk to all parties involved. David's continued work on the garden door mechanism was producing results, though the ancient hardware required careful manipulation to avoid triggering additional security measures. He could hear Captain Harrison's voice continuing to call for surrender, but his desperation drove him to persist in his escape attempt despite the increasingly obvious presence of security personnel on both sides of his position. The emerald necklace caught the faint light filtering through the door mechanism as David worked, its beauty providing a stark contrast to the desperate circumstances of his situation. He found himself thinking about Margaret's words when she had pleaded for its return, recognizing for the first time the deeper significance of what he had taken beyond its monetary value. Captain Harrison's radio communication with the security control room provided updates on the positioning of garden security personnel and the technical status of the door David was attempting to breach. The coordinated response was proceeding according to established protocols, but Harrison remained concerned about the unpredictable nature of cornered suspects. The medieval tunnel system where this drama was unfolding had witnessed countless historical events over the centuries, from royal escapes during times of political upheaval to secret meetings that shaped British history. The current situation added another chapter to the ongoing story of these ancient passages and their role in the palace's security architecture. Detective Inspector Matthews had begun coordinating with international art theft databases to check for any similar cases that might be connected to David's methods or possible associates. The professional nature of his approach suggested this might not be his first attempt at stealing valuable historical artifacts from high-security locations. Margaret's emotional state was stabilizing as she focused on the hope that the ongoing security operation would result in the necklace's recovery. She had been moved to a private sitting room where she could wait more comfortably while remaining available for additional questions or identification procedures that might be required. The support she was receiving from other Heritage Foundation members was helping her maintain perspective on the situation. Several other families shared stories of their own experiences with threats to family heirlooms, creating a sense of community and mutual understanding that provided emotional comfort during the crisis. David's breakthrough with the door mechanism came suddenly, with ancient gears and levers finally yielding to his persistent efforts. The heavy wooden door began to swing open, revealing the palace gardens bathed in afternoon sunlight. For a brief moment, he felt the exhilaration of potential success, but his celebration was short-lived as he immediately saw the security personnel positioned throughout the garden area. The garden security team had been discreetly positioned behind trees, monuments, and landscaping features that provided natural cover while maintaining clear sight lines to the door David was now opening. Their professional positioning demonstrated the thorough planning that had gone into the palace's security response. Captain Harrison heard the sound of the door mechanism engaging and knew that the pursuit was entering its final phase. He increased his pace through the tunnel, understanding that the next few moments would determine whether David was apprehended with the necklace still in his possession or whether the situation would escalate into a more complex chase through the palace grounds. The afternoon sun that had earlier illuminated the Heritage Foundation ceremony now cast long shadows across the palace gardens, creating a dramatic backdrop for what appeared to be the climactic moments of the theft and pursuit. The beauty of the carefully maintained grounds provided a stark contrast to the tension and desperation of the unfolding security situation. David stepped through the ancient doorway into the palace gardens, his eyes immediately adjusting to the bright afternoon sunlight after the darkness of the underground tunnels. The manicured lawns, pristine flower beds, and centuries-old oak trees that surrounded him would have been breathtaking under different circumstances, but his focus was entirely consumed by the security personnel he could see positioned strategically throughout the garden area. The lead garden security officer, Sergeant Michael Torres, had been briefed on the situation and was prepared for David's emergence from the tunnel system. Torres had 15 years of experience in royal protection details and understood the delicate balance required when dealing with suspects on palace grounds where any escalation could have far-reaching consequences. David's grip on the emerald necklace tightened as he assessed his options, none of which appeared favorable. The garden's layout, which had been designed for beauty and ceremony, now seemed like a carefully constructed trap, with security personnel positioned at every potential exit route. The afternoon sun reflected off the necklace's surface, creating brief flashes of green light that seemed to mock his desperate situation. Captain Harrison emerged from the tunnel moments after David, his radio crackling with coordinated updates from the various security teams now surrounding the area. The pursuit that had begun in the Grand Hall's civilized atmosphere had evolved into a tense standoff in the palace gardens, with the stolen family heirloom serving as the focal point of an increasingly complex security operation. The gardens themselves told their own story of British history, with different sections representing various royal periods and architectural styles. David found himself standing near a memorial fountain dedicated to Queen Victoria, its bronze figures seeming to observe the unfolding drama with silent judgment. The irony of committing a crime against family heritage in such a historically significant location was not lost on him. Sergeant Torres called out to David with practiced authority, identifying himself and requesting that he surrender the stolen property and submit to arrest. His voice carried the weight of years of training in crisis management, but it also conveyed a genuine interest in resolving the situation without violence or further complications. David's response revealed the internal conflict he was experiencing between his desperation for success and his growing recognition of the situation's futility. He spoke about his family's financial struggles, his inability to find steady employment, and his belief that the wealth displayed at events like the Heritage Foundation Gala represented an unfair concentration of resources. The conversation that followed between David and Sergeant Torres was witnessed by multiple security personnel and recorded by surveillance systems, creating a detailed record of David's motivations and mental state. His words provided insight into the social and economic factors that had contributed to his decision to commit such a high-profile theft. Back in the palace, Margaret had been informed about the garden standoff and the ongoing negotiations for her necklace's return. The news brought a mixture of hope and anxiety as she realized that the situation was reaching a critical point where the outcome would determine whether her family's treasured heirloom would be recovered or potentially lost forever. Detective Inspector Matthews was coordinating with the garden security team while continuing to build the case against David. The evidence was overwhelming, from multiple witness statements to video surveillance that documented every phase of the theft and pursuit. However, the detective's primary concern remained the safe recovery of the necklace and the peaceful resolution of the standoff. The Heritage Foundation guests had been moved to a secure area of the palace where they could wait comfortably while the security situation was resolved. Many of them remained deeply concerned about Margaret's loss, understanding from their own family experiences how devastating it would be to lose such a significant piece of family history. Lord Pemberton had taken it upon himself to coordinate communication between the security teams and Margaret, ensuring that she remained informed about developments while being shielded from unnecessary stress. His military background made him an ideal liaison between the various parties involved in the situation. David's position in the garden was becoming increasingly untenable as additional security personnel arrived to reinforce the perimeter. Plainclothes officers mingled with gardening staff and maintenance workers, creating multiple layers of surveillance and containment that made escape virtually impossible. The emerald necklace remained clutched in David's hand, its weight serving as a constant reminder of both his crime and the mounting consequences he would face. The afternoon sun illuminated the piece's intricate craftsmanship, highlighting the skill of the artisans who had created it nearly 4 centuries earlier for the first Earl of Thornfield. Captain Harrison positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with David, while coordinating with the garden security team. His experience in similar situations told him that the standoff was approaching a resolution point, where David would either surrender voluntarily or attempt a final desperate escape attempt. The palace's crisis management protocols had been activated, bringing together representatives from the royal household, the Metropolitan Police, and palace security to ensure coordinated decision-making. The situation's high profile and the involvement of historical artifacts required careful handling to protect both public safety and the institution's reputation. Technical Sergeant Wong had established comprehensive surveillance coverage of the garden area, with multiple cameras providing different angles of the standoff. The video feed was being monitored by senior security officials, who could provide real-time guidance to the personnel directly involved in negotiations with David. Sergeant Torres continued his patient dialogue with David, drawing upon crisis negotiation techniques designed to build rapport while gradually persuading suspects to surrender peacefully. His approach acknowledged David's stated concerns about economic inequality, while firmly explaining why theft could never be justified as a solution to social problems. The garden's peaceful atmosphere provided a surreal backdrop to the tense negotiations, with the sound of birds singing and fountain water flowing creating an almost meditative environment that contrasted sharply with the underlying tension of the security operation. David's emotional state was becoming increasingly unstable as he realized the full implications of his situation. The months of planning that had led to this moment were collapsing around him, and the prospect of facing serious criminal charges for stealing such a historically significant item was beginning to overwhelm his initial determination. Margaret's anxiety continued to mount as updates from the garden situation filtered back to her through Lord Pemberton and Detective Inspector Matthews. Each passing minute without resolution increased her fear that something might happen to damage or destroy the necklace, even if David was ultimately apprehended. The detective had been in contact with specialists in art and antique recovery who were standing by to examine the necklace for any damage once it was recovered. The piece's age and delicate construction meant that even minor mishandling could potentially cause irreversible harm to its historical integrity. David's conversation with Sergeant Torres gradually revealed more details about his background and the circumstances that had led him to attempt such a high-risk theft. He spoke about his mother's medical bills, his struggles with unemployment, and his growing resentment toward what he perceived as an unfair economic system. These revelations added complexity to the situation, as security personnel found themselves dealing with a suspect whose motivations extended beyond simple greed. David's emotional distress was genuine, even though it didn't justify his criminal actions or diminish the harm he had caused to Margaret and her family. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the garden as the standoff continued, marking the passage of time and adding subtle pressure for a resolution. The Heritage Foundation event had been scheduled to continue with an evening reception, but those plans were now in question pending the outcome of the security situation. Captain Harrison's radio communication with the security control room provided regular updates on David's behavior and demeanor, information that was being analyzed by psychological profiling experts who could provide guidance on the most effective negotiation approaches. The Palace Gardens had hosted many significant events throughout British history, from royal weddings to state ceremonies, but few had carried the dramatic tension that now surrounded the stolen necklace situation. The location's beauty and historical significance provided an almost theatrical setting for what was becoming a deeply human drama about crime, consequences, and the value of family heritage. David's grip on the emerald necklace was beginning to loosen slightly as fatigue and stress took their toll on his physical and mental state. The weight of the piece, combined with the intensity of maintaining his defensive posture, was creating additional strain that could potentially lead to the necklace being dropped or damaged. Sergeant Torres noticed this change in David's physical condition and adjusted his negotiation approach accordingly, emphasizing the importance of protecting the historical artifact regardless of the ultimate outcome of the criminal charges. This appeal to David's apparent interest in history and culture seemed to resonate with him more than previous arguments. The coordinated security response was proceeding according to established protocols, but the unique nature of the situation required flexibility and adaptation as circumstances evolved. The involvement of such a significant historical artifact added layers of complexity that went beyond typical theft cases. The turning point in the garden standoff came when David's emotional defenses finally began to crumble under the weight of his impossible situation. Sergeant Torres had been speaking for nearly 20 minutes about the historical significance of the necklace and the devastating impact its loss would have on Margaret's family, when David's shoulders sagged in visible defeat. The emerald necklace, which had remained clutched in his desperate grip throughout the pursuit and confrontation, now seemed to represent not opportunity, but the crushing weight of his poor decisions. David's voice broke as he began speaking about his grandmother, who had worked as a domestic servant in great houses similar to the palace during her youth. He described how she had told him stories about the beautiful jewelry and artwork she had seen while cleaning and serving wealthy families, always emphasizing that such treasures represented history and culture that belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy few who could afford to own them. Sergeant Torres listened with genuine attention, recognizing that David's criminal actions had grown from a complex mixture of economic desperation and misguided idealism. The negotiation techniques Torres had learned emphasized the importance of understanding suspects' motivations, even when their actions were clearly wrong and had caused significant harm. Captain Harrison maintained his position during the extended dialogue, ready to act if the situation escalated while allowing Torres to continue his patient work toward a peaceful resolution. Harrison's radio provided occasional updates from the security control room, where senior officials were monitoring the situation and providing guidance based on their assessment of David's psychological state. The afternoon sun had shifted position during the prolonged standoff, casting the garden memorial fountain in different shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation unfolding in its shadow. The bronze figures commemorating Queen Victoria's reign had witnessed many significant moments in British history, but few had involved such an intimate drama of crime, heritage, and human desperation. Margaret had been moved to a private sitting room with windows overlooking a different section of the palace grounds, where she waited with growing anxiety for news of her necklace's fate. Lady Catherine Ashworth remained with her, sharing stories of her own family's experiences, with threats to their historical artifacts as a way of providing comfort and perspective during the crisis. The conversation between Margaret and Lady Catherine had evolved into a broader discussion about the responsibilities that came with inheriting family treasures. Both women understood that they served as temporary guardians of items that carried centuries of family history and cultural significance, with obligations to preserve and protect these artifacts for future generations. Detective Inspector Matthews had completed her coordination with art theft specialists and was prepared to handle the necklace's recovery and documentation once the garden situation was resolved. The case file was already substantial, with witness statements, surveillance footage, and expert evaluations that would ensure David faced appropriate consequences for his actions. The detective's experience with similar cases had taught her that the emotional impact on victims often extended far beyond the immediate theft, particularly when family heirlooms were involved. Margaret's distress was entirely understandable, and Matthews was prepared to connect her with victim support services that specialized in helping people cope with the loss of irreplaceable personal property. David's confession in the garden revealed additional details about his planning process and the research he had conducted before attempting the theft. He described spending weeks studying the Heritage Foundation event, learning about the security procedures, and identifying the most valuable items that would be present at the ceremony. This information was crucial for Detective Inspector Matthews as she worked to determine whether David had been involved in other similar crimes, or whether he had associates who might have been planning additional thefts. The professional nature of his approach suggested capabilities that could have been applied to other high-value targets. Sergeant Torres gradually shifted the conversation toward the practical aspects of surrender, explaining the legal process David would face and emphasizing how cooperation in returning the necklace undamaged could be viewed favorably by prosecutors and judges. His approach balanced firm authority with genuine concern for David's well-being and future prospects. The garden security team had maintained their positions throughout the extended negotiation, demonstrating the patience and professionalism that characterized the palace's security protocols. Their presence provided necessary containment while allowing space for the dialogue that was slowly moving toward resolution. Technical Sergeant Wong continued monitoring the situation through multiple camera angles, providing detailed documentation that would be essential for the legal proceedings that would follow. Her coordination with the security control room ensured that senior officials remained informed about every development in the garden standoff. The palace's crisis management team had been evaluating various contingency plans throughout the situation, prepared to escalate response measures if necessary, while preferring to achieve resolution through negotiation. The involvement of such a significant historical artifact required careful consideration of all potential outcomes and their implications. David's physical exhaustion was becoming increasingly apparent as the stress and adrenaline of the pursuit and confrontation began to fade. The emerald necklace seemed to grow heavier in his grip, its weight serving as a tangible reminder of the burden he had taken on when he decided to steal such a meaningful family treasure. The moment of surrender came quietly, almost anticlimactically, when David simply opened his hand and allowed the necklace to rest in his palm while extending his arm toward Sergeant Torres. His voice was barely audible as he said he was sorry for what he had done and asked Torres to make sure the necklace was returned safely to its owner. Sergeant Torres approached David carefully, maintaining the calm demeanor that had characterized his negotiation throughout the standoff. He accepted the emerald necklace with appropriate reverence, immediately recognizing its extraordinary craftsmanship and understanding why it held such deep significance for Margaret's family. The arrest procedure was conducted with dignity and professionalism, with David offering no resistance as he was placed in handcuffs and advised of his rights. Captain Harrison assisted with the apprehension while maintaining radio communication with the security control room to report the successful resolution of the situation. The emerald necklace was immediately placed in a secure evidence container designed specifically for valuable historical artifacts. Sergeant Torres handled it with extreme care, understanding that any damage at this point could cause additional trauma to Margaret beyond what she had already experienced during the theft and recovery process. Margaret's reaction to news of the necklace's recovery was overwhelming relief, mixed with gratitude toward the security personnel who had worked so diligently to retrieve her family's treasure. Lord Pemberton delivered the news personally, his own military background helping him appreciate the skill and dedication that had made the successful recovery possible. Detective Inspector Matthews took custody of the necklace for the evidence and examination process, but she immediately arranged for Margaret to verify its condition and confirm its identity. The reunion between Margaret and her grandmother's necklace was emotional, with tears of relief replacing the anxiety and fear that had dominated her afternoon. The Heritage Foundation ceremony was quietly resumed that evening, with many guests expressing their support for Margaret and their appreciation for the security response that had protected both her family's treasure and the safety of everyone present. The incident had created an unexpected bond among the attendees, who shared a renewed understanding of their responsibilities as guardians of cultural heritage. David's legal proceedings would unfold over the coming months, with his cooperation in returning the necklace undamaged being noted as a mitigating factor in his sentencing. The case would serve as a precedent for security measures at similar events and highlight the ongoing challenges of protecting cultural artifacts in public settings. Captain Harrison returned to his regular duties with a sense of satisfaction that came from successfully completing a challenging assignment. The pursuit through the palace corridors and the eventual recovery of the stolen necklace represented exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him to handle. The medieval tunnel system that had served as the dramatic backdrop for much of the pursuit was thoroughly examined and updated with additional security measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The ancient passages had proven their continued relevance in modern security planning, even as they carried forward their centuries of historical significance. Margaret's experience with the theft and recovery of her necklace deepened her appreciation for the security personnel who worked quietly to protect both the royal household and the countless visitors who came to the palace for various events. She wrote personal thank you letters to everyone involved in the recovery effort. The emerald necklace was eventually returned to Margaret's possession after completing its role as evidence in David's trial. She wore it to the following year's Heritage Foundation Gala, where it served as a symbol of both the vulnerability and resilience of family treasures that carry forward the stories of previous generations. The incident prompted broader discussions within heritage and cultural organizations about security challenges, social responsibility, and the importance of making historical artifacts accessible to the public while ensuring their protection. Margaret became involved in these discussions, sharing her experience to help other families prepare for similar challenges. David's story, while ending in conviction and imprisonment, also sparked conversations about economic inequality and the social pressures that could drive individuals to make desperate decisions. Some advocacy groups used his case to highlight the need for better social support systems and economic opportunities for struggling families. The palace gardens returned to their usual peaceful atmosphere, with visitors unaware of the dramatic events that had unfolded near the Victoria Memorial Fountain. The beauty and tranquility of the grounds continued to provide a fitting setting for the many ceremonies and celebrations that marked the ongoing story of British cultural heritage. The emerald necklace continued to carry forward its centuries of history, now enriched with another chapter about crime and recovery, justice and mercy, and the enduring power of family legacy to survive even the most challenging circumstances. Margaret's grandmother's stories about the necklace's survival through wars and upheavals had been joined by a new tale of modern drama and successful recovery. Years later, when Margaret would eventually pass the necklace to her own daughter, the story of its theft and recovery would become part of the family lore, demonstrating once again how precious heirlooms serve not just as beautiful artifacts, but as tangible connections to the full spectrum of human experience across the generations.